Who's Dr. Stinky McDougal?
You mean the legend?
He's a real buckaroo bonsai kind of guy.
I watched him dice a guy into pieces with 6 f***ing words.
Stinky's the most inconvenient man in most rooms.
He's a master of drunk boxing.
Every time Stinky calls, my blood pressure skyrockets!
I heard he's staging an evolution.
Dr. Stinky McDougal says the difference between a revolution and an evolution is the conscious choice not to break everything in the transition.
And now, broadcasting from the borderless territory of Liberty Valley, Minnesota, here's your host, Dr. Stinky McDougal! Shake it, baby!
Hey, welcome everybody to the Dr. Stinky McDougal podcast. Today, I have a really exciting guest for us, Ed Casas, and Ed is coming here today to talk to us about the Tridactyls that have been discovered in Peru. There have been several researchers who have done several different types of exploration of this, and I found that the information is at a point now where I think we're ready to start having a legitimate conversation about, one, are these real or are they a fake? But more importantly, if they are real, what does this tell us about where we are in our evolution of, people, of society, of the world? Because we've questioned for a long time whether or not we're alone in the universe, and several people have suggested we're not alone here on Earth. And so with that, I'm going to welcome Ed in. Ed, welcome to the show, and I'll turn it over to you. What would you like to start by introducing our audience to?
Well, I guess a little bit about myself. Recently there was a skeptic who said that Ed, me, was LARPing as an archaeologist, which is funny because there's a bunch of different personalities and characters involved in all of this. And you'll be hard-pressed to actually find a lot of legitimate archaeologists in this. And so I am quite proud and quite happy to say that I am a graduate of Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida, where I received my anthropology, social science, and ethnic studies degree. And with that, at that time, while I was pursuing my degree, I ended up volunteering at the local Graves Museum of Natural History and Archaeology. And I started as a mere docent, a tour guide. And that allowed me so many opportunities, which included working in the paleontological lab, working alongside paleontological prodigy Bobby De Palma, who's appeared on Attenborough's BBC. We were good friends and till the Tridactyls, and he won't call me back. So, it's funny. I got that degree because I just figured, I was already doing some acting as a young man, and I wanted something that I could use to teach history and social studies without actually getting a teaching degree. I wanted something that would keep me interested. And through the museum, I had no plans of doing any archaeology. But through the museum, not only did I perform archaeology with the museum, but also with the Miami-Dade archaeologist who became my mentor, Gary Biter. We went and did a wonderful walking survey of the famed Miami Circle together. And a lot of what we did was CRM, cultural resource management work with a company called Janus, and the Army Corps of Engineers, because what the Army Corps of Engineers was doing is they were reflowing all the water that they had blocked 10 decades ago from Lake Okeechobee, and they were trying to reintroduce waterways, and they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to flood any locations, any important sites. So through all these, I did hands-on working archaeology. What people don't tell you is archaeology in Florida is very hot, except for today. I get to wear my leather jacket. It's very hot and very labor intensive. But nonetheless, I'll always have the vision of when one of the supervisors said, pick your location you'd like to dig in. And I saw a tree island. And honestly, I wanted the tree island mostly because it was shady. But I also knew that the Native Americans had used these tree islands when the water did flow through there. And sure enough, I pulled a nice white shirt projectile point while I was doing the sifting and my buddy was doing the actual digging. So it's funny whenever anyone ever asks, so are you a real archaeologist? I always have that image of that wonderful projectile point. So yeah, you're going to be hard pressed to find a lot of people that were archaeologists, paleontological technicians, and museum educators. At this museum, I ran the education department.
So educate us here from the very start. Let me ask you this. There are a lot of people who are unfamiliar with what the Tridactyls are. Start by telling us, what is the backstory to the Tridactyls, and what is this phenomenon we're looking at?
So as far back as 2000, I think 16, I don't know if it was a reporter or the actual Huaqueros. So the Huaqueros are grave robbers, which, you know, when you think about it, could be looked at in a poor light. Of course it is. It's illegal, and they're taking cultural artifacts. But in reality, who better to find such an interesting find? And what they found were a series of three-fingered beings, hence the term tridactyl. And what they did was they brought these beings to the local adventurer outfitter, if you will, Terry Jamin, who spends most of his time looking for lost cities of gold, not as a Huaquero. He is, in fact, when you talk to Terry, you can see that he is always super concerned, and at the highest point of his concern is the cultural heritage of Peru. So when people do talk about Huaqueros and this black market of artifacts and bodies, he's not part of that. He is quite the opposite. So that's where it began with the phenomenon. It wasn't until years later, 2023, when the bodies, some of them did end up out of the country, and so the Mexican Congress held a what would you call it? I don't know, a meeting, and Jaime Maussan was there. Jaime Maussan's a sort of known ufologist, but you know, Jaime Maussan has his own background. He's an award-winning 60-minute reporter for 60 Minutes Mexico. You know, 60-minute reporters tend to have a bit of credentials and legitimacy. But unfortunately, Maussan also is sort of well, he investigates lots of things that maybe didn't always end up being true. So what ended up happening is Maussan helped. So we're dealing with certain uncertainties. The Huaqueros, unscrupulous fortune hunters. Maussan, who investigates strange phenomenon. But for me, while watching this, one of the most important testimonies was from Dr. Jose Zalci Benitez. Dr. Zalci Benitez is a forensic doctor for the Mexican military. So here's this gentleman in forensics, a forensic anthropologist, mind you, giving a testimony and showing a slideshow of what he believes to be living things. Now, admittedly, when I saw these pictures come across my Google feed, I dismissed them like everyone else. But it took a friend of mine to say, hey, you might want to check those out again. And that's interesting, too. I even think of that friend because that friend had a credibility level with me, enough for me to say, oh, let me go check that out. Now, maybe if it was someone else who wasn't as credible, maybe I wouldn't be here today. So that also led me, Zalci Benitez led me to a report from Clifford Miles, who is a Canadian paleontologist. So you can see we're already building this sort of international network of experts. So being that my background is anthropology, paleontology, to hear Zalci Benitez speak and to hear a paleontologist speak who's also incidentally a published paleontologist, not just, I think he has his own firm in Canada where he, however that works, I don't know, financially speaking, but he has his own paleontological company in Canada. So with those two, I felt they were legitimate witnesses. And for me, what just really kind of started almost an existential moment was when I recognized the beings. And what I mean by that was it dawned on me that I had seen these 20 years ago in petroglyphs in Bella Coola, Canada, and in the Caribbean from the Taino people. So at that point, it became sort of personal. And I even remember, now I don't know how many questions you can remember from your university days, but I remember asking my professor, He was in charge of the Americas department. And I said to him, is there any connection between these Canadian petroglyphs and these Caribbean petroglyphs? And he said no, which is the standard academia answer. It's coincidence, or they have a term for it. They call it independent innovation. That means the people in Canada and the people in the Caribbean, since they were thousands of miles and equally perhaps thousands of years apart, just independent innovation, that they both just happen to create these, what I say are cordiform faced. So when I mean cordiform faced, I mean heart-shaped face. So you can actually see it here in this model of Josephina. She has a heart-shaped face, which it turns out, after noting these and the tridactyl limbs that were accompanied these petroglyphs, it turns out this heart-shaped face is actually universal and can be found globally across the world.
Does this mean that we're going to find these specimens in other parts of the world? So one of our guests here, Daniel, we were just chatting about this before we got on, and Daniel's here with us as well. One of the things we were chatting about is, why aren't we finding these specimens elsewhere in the world, or do you think we will? And if we're finding these petroglyph symbols of them, these etchings of them, will we find these in other parts of the world as well? Why is this just in Peru right now?
Well, I mean, I can speculate on why it's just in Peru, and my research has led me. Let me take it back a little bit. So, these petroglyphs were also found in association with spirals that could be construed as water symbols, or even fertility symbols, or even serpentine symbols. And the cordiform faces and tridactyl limbed beings were frequently depicted in mother goddess imagery. So that means they had a smaller being either between their arms and legs, or they were actually depictions of these sort of stick figure beings giving birth. So it is with these symbols that I realized that this was sort of a something that should be looked at all together. And so my term is, this seems to be a depiction of what I say is a water serpent mother goddess complex. So if you were to search for, going back in time to find a similar belief system, it took me to the belief in the Naga and the dragons. Now, we think of dragons in the Western myth, but in Asia, dragons are a completely different thing. Dragons and Nagas are ancestral beings. And so my research took me all the way to the Himalayan plateau, and I'm saying figuratively, I didn't really go there, where I suggest this was an origin point for this serpentine mother goddess cult. So you asked, why is this in Peru? This could have been either a starting point of a culture, or perhaps even a finality and ending point for the culture. So that is perhaps why we're seeing in there. Keep in mind too, with the Taino of the Caribbean and another cultural region, the Maori. The Maori have their tiki idols, little green, cordiform faced tridactyl beings, which you can probably, I wouldn't doubt it if Momoa is probably, he probably has some around. He wears the male version, which is almost like a serpentine fish hook. The tiki is usually feminine. But when you look at these and you realize that the Caribbean and New Zealand were two of the last places not only colonized by humanity, but two of the last places that were colonized by more recent Europeans. So one of the reasons could be is that these were the last locations that these beings were in, with Peru perhaps being a safe point high up in the Andes, far away from what could have been a prediction on their part that eventually these primates would eventually locate them. So, I mean, that's my best reason why we're finding them there. But I would suggest there's no reason why we couldn't find them in other places.
One of the interesting things about these specimens, so, if we sort of deal with the question and go, let's say that they're real rather than, a deep fake. Many of these specimens have been found with implants, metal implants, right? Tell us about those metal implants and what they might indicate in terms of a people or a civilization.
Well, they vary. Most of the metal implants have a local alloy that you would find in South America, and that includes a copper alloy. However, there are some anomalies where one of them, known as the big hand, has iron in it, which is not a typical metal found in the Americas. And that big hand is suggested to be thousands of years old, 3,000 to 6,000 years old, which would put it in a very interesting historical point in humanity's history. There is talk also of osmium. I personally haven't seen the metallurgy report on the osmium, but osmium is a very rare metal suggested to be used in satellite technology and would require a large-scale industrial activity to create these. Those implants, typically, many of them have a chest implant. There's a specimen known as Alberto who has a hip implant. There is Sebastian who has a metal implant on the back of their neck. And there are implants in the hands. Now, I personally have a theory on those implants, but we'll save that for now. Maybe we'll get back to that.
Has anyone now? The osmium is a very interesting point because I understand it's a very rare element, and so when we look at the question of were these, is this somebody just pulling the wool over people's eyes? The answer to the question, in part, is why would you go to such degrees to create these with such a rare element? If you were just making a fake, right? I mean, you would really want to try and create, a fake to go, see, if I do this, then they're really going to have trouble with it. But that's not what that seems to be about. Do we have a feeling of whether or not these were electrical instruments? Do we have a feeling that, has anyone tried to run electricity through these to see what
I think they have done some tests. And honestly, I feel like as much as I love ufology, I think people's speculation runs away with them at times. And part of my research is, I guess we will kind of jump ahead on this, is my research has led me to believe that these are predominantly an amphibian grade hybridization. And I'll tell you why I think that. We can start with the simple low branch, which is the Tridactyl. They have 3 fingers. And we can find that in modern day animals, typically salamanders or frogs with 3 fingers. The other thing that is suggested is that they do not have lungs and that they would breathe cutaneously, cutaneous breathing. So that's another very strong amphibian trait. Maria was...
You mean they breathe through their skin?
Yes, exactly. Breathe through their skin, which, again, nothing too unusual there. I mean, obviously, compared to mammals, quite unusual, but we have animals on planet Earth that'll do that. The other thing was that they suggested that Maria's doesn't have a coccyx. Her lower vertebra are fused. And personally, when I looked at that, there's going to be things that, I'm going to tell you today. There are also my own theories on this that perhaps the other researchers haven't jumped onto quite as yet, but I think they'll have no choice. And that is that fused vertebra looks like something to me that I call a urostyle, which is what you would find in Anuran frogs when they resorb their tail. They are left with a very similar bone that would resemble this fused vertebra of Maria. So you see, we have several amphibian traits. Now, I have a saying that suggests that the archaeology predicts the biology. And I'm going to show you something that I have here, probably a replica, I don't know. This is a Hongshan pig dragon, they call it. And when I saw these, I suggested that perhaps the ancients were well aware of the tridactyls and that they were able to know that they go through a metamorphosis, which is another very important amphibian trait. So between that and various, and your audience should look these up, go to your Paracas ceramics, your Paracas fabrics, your Nazca people, Wari, I believe, is another culture of South America. And you'll see that many of these depict serpentine shapes. Some of these serpentine shapes have 2 forelimbs that you might find in an axolotl larva. So an axolotl is a type of salamander, and unlike a frog, where frogs develop their rear limbs first, the axolotl develop forelimb first. So there are images of forelimb first beings with 3 fingers. So to me, I started to, as after probably looking at so many different cultures, including the Magatama of Japan. Magatama are very similar to this, but less detailed, and seem to represent some sort of a embryonic form, which other archaeologists had said even before the Tridactyls came around. So with these clues, when I was given access, early access, mind you, to the Tridactyl scans, I immediately began to look for larvae. Why? Because also, I suggest cosmology predicts the biology of the Tridactyls. And what I mean by cosmology, I mean mythology. Why do I suggest mythology predicts the Tridactyls? I predict that, excuse me, I'm getting a little tongue-tied here. The mythology suggests the biology. And so if you go into tales of the Dogon, they speak of hermaphroditic amphibians. And there's always these tales of metamorphosis and shape-shifting through our culture. And other things I saw was something called the mind-born motif. Maybe you've heard of this. Beings, gods like Athena and Zeus being born from skulls. Or you may see images of serpentine beings with life forms coming out of their mouth. A good one is the water jaguars of Mesoamerica, which has these life scrolls, they call them. And there's these three images coming out of the water panther's mouth that look just like the Magatama embryonic forms. So keep in mind, I'm putting all of this together, and rather than looking at things as just myth and lies or just cartoon images, it informed me that there is a chance that these beings went through a metamorphosis, and that these mind-born motifs and this life from the mouth motif may have something to it. So I began to look at the scans, and what I did was I had to get a specific, what's called a Python script that I had to add to the 3D slicer, which, by the way, again, if your audience is listening, you can go to my friend's website, tridactyls.org. You can download Maria's DICOM files, her medical files yourself. You can download Wawita's medical files yourself. Bear in mind, both of these just recently have now been deemed official cultural patrimony by the Ministry of Culture of South America. I think that is important. This has just happened. I think it's an important thing to know. So sure enough, as I went into the scans, I took this Python script, which means I was able to get 0.75 of a millimeter, and what the program would do is put 3 slices of this very tiny amount. And sure enough, as I went into the slices, I began to find what I believe are larval forms. In fact, in one of my lectures, I said, I bet you I'm going to find some of these in the skull one day because of these myths. And sure enough, as I go into the skulls and the mouths, I assert that there are larval forms within the bodies from head to toe. So you asked me about the metal implants. I have a theory that the metal implants and the diatomaceous earth and cadmium chloride, which is on the bodies, which, if you can imagine, if we're still talking about cutaneous breathers, can you imagine covering something with diatomaceous earth and calcium chloride? Excuse me, chromium? Cadmium chloride, I believe is what it is. What that would do, which would be disastrous and could possibly likely kill the being. What I suggest is that these implants and this diatomaceous earth mix was also part of a larval management problem. So why do I say that? So when I go into these metal implants that are on the chest, they happen to be just under a furcula. So what is a furcula? And we can debate whether it's actually a protofurcula, it's a fused clavicle or an interclavicle, and I've had these discussions with other paleontologists. Furcula is a good, easy term. You see a furcula typically every Thanksgiving when you split your wishbone. So it's this fused clavicle. You know, it's one of the ways I can tell, like, if you look at some of these imitations out there, I'm like, doesn't have a fused clavicle. It's probably, why would they have a fused clavicle? Probably part of that forelimb first development, I would imagine. These beings were mostly going on their 2 legs when they were young. So the furculas are fractured, which other researchers have noted. But on my closer inspection, it appears as though these larvae have used their rostrum beaks. So they have a sort of a turtle-like beak, if you will. Not a pronounced beak, but definitely a hard plate that seems to be sharpened with even some proto fangs. I suggest they use these to burrow through the bone and are compromising the integrity of the beings.
So you're suggesting that these tridactyls had an infestation of sorts.
And not an infestation. It's more of due to perhaps ovoviviparity, which means the eggs hatched within, or perhaps even other amphibian parallel traits such as gastric brooding or mouth brooding, which is interesting because in some amphibian species, the male will actually hold the juveniles in their mouths. So I'm suggesting that because of these amphibian traits, this was the case. But here's the thing. Some specimen like Artemis has a series of implants. And this is where I began to think that, oh, these implants are part of this larval removal. And why would that be? Well, part of these, when we'll look at the scans, part of the structure of the tridactyls is they also, in addition to that furcula, they have what are called gastralia, which are stomach ribs, which you can find today in modern crocodilians. So, just to go back to, just looking at some of these traits, we have cutaneous breathing of an amphibian, a furcula that you might find in a bird or perhaps some sort of theropod dinosaur, and gastralia that you would find in a crocodilian. So these traits altogether allude to something, to my opinion, from deep time. So those larvae appear to be getting born within and then burrowing in between these gastralia and these ribs. So it suggests to me that whoever was, whether it was them or a peripheral being or species, they were well aware of this larval issue and perhaps continued, despite how it was damaging, it continued with this system. So I almost look at the bodies as more of they look more like hives than a host.
That's a really interesting way to look at this. And your description of the beings. So one, do you have any slides or anything you want to share?
I do. I have lots of stuff we could show, obviously, but probably the most important thing here is just to look at someone like Josephina. And
now,
Josephina,
just to start out, this is one of the very first creatures that I had seen when I was first introduced to what was going on. And if I'm not mistaken, Josephina actually has eggs, doesn't she?
Yes, she has. In fact, the majority, I would say, most of these little ones, this is about 60 centimeters, have at least 3 eggs, maybe even 4. A fourth one might be developing in some of them. They have eggs. In fact, it was in Artemis back in, I think it was the summer of 2024, when I detected my first larval form. And when Terry Jameen saw it, he was impressed. And that made me suggest, oh, so you guys don't know about this. So it kind of, I think because of the archaeology and because of making the inference between the artifacts, it kind of gave me a leg up and a heads up on many of the researchers. And so I'm able to develop these very detailed hypotheses on the beings. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure if I...
You did. And since we're on this one little bit...
I sometimes ramble,
Yeah, since we're on this one little bit of the question, we see there are implants, as you can see on Josephina here. Have we had any indication of clothing?
There is some imagery that looks like that perhaps the Wakeros did find them with accoutrements, clothing, and perhaps jewelry and whatnot, and perhaps that was already... sold. If you watch the original documentary on the Tridactyls on Gaia, they make note of how these things got out of the country, who has them, and so there are Russian oligarchs that supposedly may have paid $1 million for one of these. So unfortunately, the evidence is slowly disappearing. Maybe it's not a bad thing, because who knows what the Peruvian government may have done with these. So we can move in here, and that is our furcula that we mentioned here. And I know a lot of people are probably familiar with some of the other, the larger, more Homo sapien or more primate versions. I spent most of my time studying these purposely because they were less human. And again, we can see those gastralia stomach ribs right here, which probably also aided in their keeping a support for cutaneous breathing, and probably also aided for them to be ground crawling. And again, I mentioned that four-limb first development, which is why Josephina's arms are actually longer than her legs.
Now, one of the questions that some folks might have is that, we've got this one specimen. How many different modalities of specimens are there? Are we looking at multiple types of creatures? Are we looking at the different developmental stages of different creatures? Are we looking at frogs and lizards living together, or are we looking at the same species in different states of being?
Well, when we say species, of course, we can talk about Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis, right? We can say those are two different species, but you and I have Neanderthal in our DNA, don't we? Mm-hmm. So we can use I feel like that when we say species, your average viewer may think, dog versus bear sort of thing. And I'm suggesting they're all part of the same genus. In fact, I suggest even the genus I have my own name for it. I would suggest even Naga, because I think the Naga is one of the most codified beliefs in these beings in the past.
So they represent a unified culture of multiple species.
A unified genus. So like using Homo. So right. So what I'm saying is we have tiny ones that are only about a foot that they were calling insectoids because of the way that their spinal cord and their hip is developed, but they still have 3 fingers, they still have 4 limbs. So insectoid might not be the best term for it, especially if there's some sort of, I don't know, a different invertebrate, let's put it that way. And then of course there's Josephina, which we just looked at, which is approximately, based on Victoria's DNA, we'll say 3 to 5% primate. And then something like Maria, the larger hybrid, is maybe 30 to 33% primate. And even it doesn't stop there, because there's also the big hand, which seems to be, now the DNA hasn't been done on the smaller insectoids, but the big hand has been, and it's less than 1% currently as the last testing. That's even less, which I guess makes sense if it's coming from a deeper past. I don't know. So yeah, so I suggest it's all one genus. It's a tridactyl genus with varying degrees of admixture of primate.
Daniel, you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, many, many. So tell us, how many of these mummies or fossils have been found?
Oh, I think they're up to like 30 by now, but rumor has it that there are hundreds or thousands.
Tell me about the hundreds or thousands, because you could have somebody with a hoax make 30. I think under 100, it's potential to have somebody make it as a hoax. But when you start getting towards the thousands, you would have to fund an effort like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and the other thing about the hoaxing is, while I would love to entertain these hoaxes, I have yet to find one person who can provide a credible explanation as to why it's a hoax and how it was done. The thing out there, I hear people throwing the word taxidermy around, and it seems as though they don't understand how taxidermy works. One of the basic things that happens in taxidermy is the skin is separated from the bones. The bones is then mounted separately with an armature, some usually metal, and then the skin would then be placed over a simulated skeleton. I mean, that's typically how taxidermy works. And looking at the scans, there is no armature, there is no seams. An important witness in all of this, which is not a paleontologist, not an archaeologist, but a plastic surgeon. I thought, what a strange and great witness to all of this. And this gentleman is saying he sees no evidence of manipulation, no cut marks on the outside of the skin. So
sure. So
and then answer your question about the numbers. So, of course, the Vaqueros are still in charge of this. I mean, this is an ATM for them. So they're not really prepared, I guess, to reveal everything as of yet.
Fill me in, though. Who are the Vaqueros?
They're the grave robbers of South America, an organized crime network in rural areas of the country. Which, if you want to get into conspiracy theories, there are suggestions that the government's working with them, members of the government. So that's problematic right there.
Do they have one site that they're drawing these from, or do they have several sites that they're saying they're finding this
That
out?
seems to be a bit of a confusion also, with possibly specimens coming from multiple sites. So they talk about the Citadel. In fact, on the video, the first series video, they show this, like, it looks like a Dungeons and Dragons map. It's pretty cool. I'm like, is that really what it looked like? Because it was very interesting, of stone hallways. But then when Terry asks the Vaquero to take him to the site, he ends up taking him to a very shallow, diatomaceous cave, which would seem like the perfect place to store them. So perhaps it's a bit of both. There's also videos of what looks like an archaeological, an ancient site, let's say. And so it looks like we're getting conflicting information even on that. And that's one of the critiques of all this. They say that there's no provenance, so it must be fake. But, even working at a museum, you could have someone bring in a private collection, which you'll see also happen on some of the videos. There's one of the mummies came from a private collection, and it comes in a Rubbermaid tub, and people are like, oh, look at the Rubbermaid tub. But this is the practical reality, especially when you're dealing with a town in poverty, a university in poverty. I worked at a museum that didn't have a lot of funding. You'd be surprised at how many things are in cardboard boxes and plastic bags, just out of the reality of it.
Sure. And there's a debate from this relative to credentialism. And you're always going to lose that debate, because the credentialists made up the credentials. And so
well, that's kind of like the peer review sort of argument too, right?
Sure. And Ghislaine Maxwell's father invented peer review, because they want to control the information. Yeah. Look that up. And so,
well, that's not encouraging. That's not encouraging at all. Really? Okay. Interesting.
I mean, knowledge is not an encouraging thought when you look at its provenance.
That's true.
So, I'm curious about where you think these beings originated from, and like why did they go away? Like where, do you have any myths that told them? Yeah.
The myths suggest that tutelary beings emerged from the water taught man.
Say that word again.
Tutelary or tutory beings, tutors emerged from the sea.
So
to teach man civilization, language, basket weaving.
Okay.
And combined with these mother serpent myths, even the Dogon suggests that the mother serpent goddess ends up breeding with descendants of her descendants, a sort of alluding to an ancient back crossing. So if you wanted to breed a trait into something, or perhaps out, you would back cross the original mother with one of their descendants. And another myth too is the ogress of Tibet. The ogress of Tibet is said to have, forget Genesis for a moment. The ogress of Tibet is said to have mated with a monkey god to create humanity. It's almost like they're telling us what happened. So, and that's another reason why I suggest the Naga, or dragons. There are tribes still today in a region called Nagaland. And these tribes, some of the women will practice neck extension. This is in Southeast Asia, not Africa, mind you. And why do they practice that neck extending? So they can emulate the dragon mother. Another tribe ends up tattooing the supraorbital arches. This is one of the reasons why I'm pretty confident that this has primate DNA in it. That is not this might not be alien, because when even you just look at this profile, perhaps from just the top up, it's not that different than like a Homo longi or a dragon man. It's very similar.
Has
But
anyone
this
looked
other
at the
tribe,
similarities
yeah,
between the elongated skulls of South America and these species? I mean, one of the things we can't ignore is the fact that they have this elongated skull, and there are elongated skulls in South America that are unexplainable. But it's almost as if we are now dealing with like there's the elongated skulls, which seem to have human characteristics, and then there's these that have elongated skulls. I mean, it's like we have an entire genome going on in South America that's just now coming to revelation.
and keep in mind, though, elongated skulls is also something culturally you can find globally. And most of the time, it is head binding. Absolutely. But me as an anthropologist, most people are going to stop there. I'm like, well, they did head binding in, wherever, Timbuktu. And it's like, my question is the anthropologist, yeah, but why? Why did they do that? And it's emulation. So going back to that tribe in Nagaland, not only do they tattoo the supraorbital arches, but they'll also tattoo the temporal bones that come off the side. And another sort of prediction that the archaeology provided me was I kept seeing cross-hatching, your hashtag. I kept seeing your cross-hatching patterns in ceramics, and I said, this seems to be alluding to a reptilian theme. I see it on serpents and whatnot. Well, don't you know that once close-ups of the skin were available, right on that skin is a cross-hatching rhomboid pattern, and this tribe in Nagaland tattoos that cross-hatching on their chest.
Very interesting. So this is one of those more out there questions, but I think it's worth asking. Is it me, or do these creatures look an awful lot like either E.T. or like the characters from Close Encounters of the Third Kind?
They sure do, don't they? And that makes me also, since we have to now ask ourselves some questions, such as, obviously the first thing we're all going to think of is like, well, they obviously copied ET, right? But once we look at the archaeological record, and I suggest that the Maori's tiki look like similar to the Bella Kula and the Taino people, or we can go to the Joman culture of the Ainu people, where once again we have heart-shaped faced beings there. Or we can even look, if you're looking for a European culture, there is the Permian bronze animal style, which seems to depict these tridactyl beings with heart-shaped heads in family units, as though they were caught at a time of intimacy. We caught the snapshot in time. And also the Syrian, which could tie into the big hand, the Syrian eye idols of the fertility goddess of Tel Brak. They look like little gingerbread ET cookies. So really the question is, at this stage, why does ET look like them? Now, ET has 4 fingers on his hands, but he has 3 fingers. He's famous for his neck extending, and he has that heart-shaped face. I mean, if you're looking for Tridactyl souvenirs, you might as well start with ET. And I remember when Close Encounters came out, we all said, wow, how realistic looking is that? So I think the question is, did Spielberg know? Because he worked in close proximity with Professor Hynek of Blue Book, and did he have inside knowledge, and is that why he designed his aliens to look like that? Or is it something else, that this is just a subconscious thing in human psyche that is revealing itself for reasons? Or we can even we can take it another step farther in speculation. Is this divine intervention, and Spielberg had the seed planted or something like that? So I think the Occam's razor is that Spielberg knew damn well what these things were. And so I think he needs to be grilled, or at least his FX guy does, right?
In the corner of my videos, I don't know if most people have ever noticed this, but I use a little image of the Great Gazoo, a little green guy. So most of these creatures are covered by a diatomaceous substance, which is a white powdery substance. Are we talking about little green men here? Are they green underneath? What is the skin color and the tone and the skin telling us?
Well, the skin is looking a bit gray, admittedly. But that could still just be because of a necrotic flesh. That tiki idol that I mentioned of the Maori and many of the original pig dragons are in jade. So there is, at the very least, in the Circum-Pacific, I say that's a group. I'm at the stage now where, I don't believe in independent innovation. I allude to hyperdiffusion. So some sort of cultural complex related to reverence of these beings spread out. And that is associated with many, many green stone artifacts. And if these are the amphibian traits I'm suggesting, wouldn't these amphibian traits and these green stone artifacts sort of collaborate with one another? So I suggest they are green, and that gray flesh that we're seeing now as the diatomaceous earth is removed. And actually, one of the independent skulls, I just tweaked it a little bit on Photoshop. I didn't do much with it. I don't know, it was the tint or something. I must have moved it just a bit. And don't you know that gray popped green very well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's one of the questions that a lot of people will have when they start to look at this. Right? It's really interesting because I'm a big believer in the 3 stages of discovery. The first one being that discoveries are first ignored, and then they're fought, and then they become self-evident. And this emerged
we're
10
fighting
years ago and it has been ignored for 10 years, and it is only now coming to the stage where I'm seeing people on X who are college professors. One in particular comes to mind, Joseph Wilson, going, these things are a fake, they're a scam, they're a doll, they've been stitched together. And the fight over the legitimacy of this has really, begun to kick in, which means that we're heading towards these either being self-evident or being dismissed. What is that process look like, and how far along do you think we are to, the world socially accepting that the Overton window of our past has been open to a new ontological idea?
Boy, I'm not sure, because as you mentioned it, the Latin American teams have been at this now for 9 years. I'm going on 3 years straight of full-time research. And what I mean by full-time research, gentlemen, that means like today, I wake up and today I was working on my proboscis theory. That is, in my experience in the scans, what I see are larval forms engaged in adelphophagy, sibling predation. And so what I've seen in the scans is a high density structure, tubular linear structure coming from their mouth. And this corroborates, is that the word? With a couple of other studies. Cliff Miles suggested that behind the sinus, behind the nostrils, was a piece of fleshy material. And then the hands-on researchers in Latin America who have really been working on this have discovered an orifice, some sort of feeding orifice that they suggest is for liquid. And so putting these 3 data sets together, most importantly is what I see in the scans, it would suggest that there is a proboscis coming from their mouth. And I bring that up only because that's what I was working on today. I literally do this every day. I'm going through my own resources. I should probably start every lecture with you guys like, I'm not paid by Masan. There's nobody paying me to say anything. I'm an independent researcher. You can find me at Tridactyls or tridactyls.com. I'm not tridactyls.org. And the other website that everyone should go to, probably with their kids even, is the-alien-project.com. That's Terry Jamin. That's the original guys doing the Gaia work. They got a beautiful website, and you can literally go in there and interact with their digital reproductions of the scans. It's super fun. That's the other thing. This has been completely 100% rewarding for me. I mean, I've never been so happy to have my degree at this time, and I feel like part of my mission here is to bring some sort of down-to-earth credibility. Let's get away from the speculation. Now, I understand, someone like Wilson or Dr. Proctor, they outrank me in this. But arguably, you could say I outrank them in that I've been researching this full-time now for almost 3 years. What you have to be careful with these gentlemen, including their sort of their ringleader, Will Brown, is... And what I did was I took their videos and I ran it through AI because I started to hear things in my spidey senses were tingling. And when you go through their video, they only spend about, I don't know, 10-15% of the time actually talking about the tridactyls. Some of the time they talk about human anatomy. They go into very much detail about human anatomy, sort of demonstrating how much they know about human anatomy. But then when you look at the 1/3 of what they say, and this is AI, but my instincts alerted me to it, is ad hominem attacks and pleas of emotion, emotional pleas. So anytime when someone says, Mason's a bad guy, Dr. Zalsi Benitez believes in Roswell, there's grave robbing, there's people making money, all of that is superfluous and has absolutely nothing to do with the science and certainly nothing to do with what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think when you look at Egyptology and you go back to the 1800s and in that era, there were a lot of people making a lot of money, but the research was what was done. So a lot of people hear, "Oh, you're making money." That's just they're saying anything to get you to turn off the investigative side of your brain.
It's strange, very strange. And myself, I think I made 2 cents on TikTok. To be clear, I'm not monetized, and every project I've ever done in my life. Yeah,
maybe you are, maybe you aren't. I'm not really concerned about that.
Well, it's one of those weird things that comes up, right?
Well, listen, it's a simple fact. The number of people monetize with contrary beliefs, monetization is not a proof of veracity or anti-veracity.
Yeah, it's like, is it illegal for people to make money?
It's so you know, we want to believe that our truth is given to us purely and wholly.
Right. Okay.
But so a lot of people just use that to short circuit because they want you to
still.
Exactly. It's advanced
much more
and a distraction, right?
Yeah. But what I'm saying is the interesting thing that I haven't picked up from, I watched a few videos about these mummies prior to this and stuff, was the amphibian nature. Now, I heard you mention that. What's really interesting is I come from the electric universe. Bob does too. But there's also the electric biology. And electric biology is a much less researched area than the electric universe. And there's two people to look into this about. There's Robert O. Becker, and he wrote the book The Body Electric. And he was hired by the Department of Defense, or I guess we're the Department of War again. It's just a much more honest label. But he was hired by the DoD to figure out how to regrow soldiers' limbs.
Oh.
And what he started to study was amphibians, specifically salamanders. And he realized that salamanders have the ability to regenerate things. Now, let's overlay that with all of the mythology. And what does all the mythology say? The gods took multiple attempts to create man. Right? Like they made a first version and it was this and they threw it away. They made a second version, and you can go to the Greeks, you can go to the Babylonians, you can go to the Mayans, right? And Bob can back me up here, but they all kind of tried to make man multiple times. Could this be one of the attempts of man? Could they have prototyped on amphibians? Because amphibians actually are the only things that do have full regeneration. You can cut, an arm off a salamander, it'll regrow it.
And on that half, is there any evidence that these things have grown additional limbs back?
So again, this is the beauty of being sort of ahead of the curve on this with I call it my amphibian assertion because I'm that confident in it. As Victoria has her right hip has been severed. But when you look at the right leg compared to the left leg, it is much more robust and looks much, much larger than the left leg. It almost alludes to me that perhaps that right leg was removed in some sort of accident, which perhaps you may even know some myths such as, what is it? I think maybe a good Anna, I think it's the name of the being. That leg was cut off and thrown to the goddess by Gilgamesh and Enki. Enkidu, is it, I believe? So I mean, Victoria appears that could very well be, And I also bring this up to other people when they find this like, well, this is anomalous or this is anomalous. I'm like, well, you got to keep in mind these are amphibians. They might be regenerating. So who knows, why there may be discrepancies. But yeah, Victoria so far for me is one of the best examples of possible regeneration because that one leg looks a lot different in my opinion. I would love to hear, obviously other people's opinions on that.
Yeah, and I find it interesting you went to the Dogon as well because they are clearly another amphibious god. And then you also hermaphroditic as well. And the hermaphrodism is very interesting, because of the amphibians are really the only hermaphroditic race, if you will. And there's talks that the Kabbalah has 6 genders and all this kind of stuff, and then anyhow, I'm going down the really deep rabbit hole here, but I guess it's really interesting. The Dogon said that they were a fish god, and Dagon is a fish god from the Bible. So like, I know I sound like I'm rhyming here, but Dagon is ultimately the story of Jonah. And of course, Jonah gets thrown over the boat, eaten by the great sea creature, and then spit up on land. And then he goes and tells them, "Hey, I got eaten by a great sea creature." So they're going to listen to him, right? But you do have this recurring amphibian thing, and I think a lot of times. So I build software, and we do this thing called typecasting, where you have a number 1, and it can be interpreted as a string, and it can be interpreted as an actual number, or it can be interpreted as a floating point, an integer, a string, or whatever. So how you interpret that describes how this variable will behave. And I think most people assume mammalian. They assume that everything is a mammal, and they can't see an advanced amphibian form. And so I think the amphibian element that you're bringing up is very important, is kind of what I'm saying. Yeah.
And keep in mind as well that not even just hermaphroditism, but these amphibians can have sequential hermaphroditism, with even the possibility of not only just switching sexes, but perhaps even switching back. And that was that clue in the mythology also, helped feed my thoughts on these being amphibians, because whether it's Loki or Set or even Yahweh, who says, I'm Yahweh now, I believe, but I was Al Shaddai. And really, in Arabic, the proper definitive article for that would be Ash Shaddai. And so, I just went off on a little tangent there. This symbol here, I like to use it because we can always say this for the Tridactyls, but this is representative of the first letter of Shaddai. And when you look at the Syriac letter for Shaddai, it's a heart shape.
Oh, really?
I like that.
Fascinating. The cultural backlog on this, given how old these things seem to be, suggests that there's an influence throughout our culture that we don't yet recognize. And perhaps when we do, it'll open us up to a new understanding of not only our origins, but of the influences that we've dealt with over the last several thousand years. Ed, you've been great to have on the show here. Is there any last thoughts that you'd like to give on the subject? Anything you want us to know that we haven't talked about, or anything you want to close with that we should remember?
Oh, boy, that's a good one. What didn't we cover here? Again, just I suggest there. Oh yeah, here we go. So when you look at the DNA, which on Big Hand is as high as I think 72%. I think I went with a number of 65%. I was going with Victoria. When you look at that percentage, and when you look at this morphological suite of traits of cutaneous breathing, furculas, gastralia, perhaps tubular hearts, perhaps a hydrostatic mechanism for extending the neck, these two data sets of the unknown DNA with this suite of morphology alludes to a origin point hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago. Now, keep that in mind for 1 second as we retrace our steps here. So to the Caribbean and to the Bellicula, we have mother goddess imagery. To the Maori, we have ancestor worship. To the Syrian eye idols, we have fertility symbols. to one more. Let's Easter Island in a cave is a very tridactyl looking face that they suggest is Make Make, a creator being. So these data sets together to me allude to a being, plus our tutelary beings that we spoke of, alludes to beings from man and the Earth's deep past and humanity's deep past. So yes, I do suggest that it's very, very possible that these are going with Make Make creator beings.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us on the podcast again today. Daniel, thanks for joining in the conversation. And for everybody on the thing here, make sure you leave us a comment down below. Leave us questions. Ed, it's been a great conversation. I'll hopefully have you back, and we'll have a further conversation. With
Oh, good. Yeah, I got a great slideshow we can go through. And
yeah.
We're just closing here on this. Also on this backdrop here is just that's looking in, and we're seeing there's a lot of soft tissue forms within the body that I suggest some of these soft tissue forms are likely, and we don't have very good imagery today, but maybe right here, these are not the best image. We'll have other ones for you of a possible larva within Josephina.
Fascinating. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the call today, and you have a good evening, and peace out, everybody.
Live long and prosper.